Dr. Bradley Folsom is a professor of history at Grayson College and is the author of Arredondo, Last Spanish Ruler of Texas and Northeastern New Spain, which received the Coral Horton Tullis Memorial Prize for Best Book on Texas History. His new book, Son of Vengeance, Searching for the Legendary Apache Raphael, came out last month. So a lot of Apache research. His paper this morning is The Four Flawed Borders, Spain Defines the Louisiana Purchase.
When Brian contacted me about doing a presentation at this year's GLO, there were two things at the forefront of my mind. So this was around March of this year. The first was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I do not want to get into modern politics at all. Everybody gets angry these days, and so I'm going to avoid this, except to say that beginning in the early 1990s, Russia acknowledged Ukrainian independence and agreed to recognize its borders. This was in spite of the fact that a majority of Crimea and portions of eastern Ukraine had greater linguistic and political ties to Russia than the rest of Ukraine. Following a series of political disagreements and citing security concerns, in 2014, Russian forces occupied Crimea, and the following year they sponsored a separatist movement in the Donbas region. In February 2022, Russia had military, political, and cultural control of these regions, even though history and other nations told them they belonged to Ukraine. In spite of this, Russian forces invaded the rest of eastern Ukraine with the express intent of demilitarizing the nation and formalizing their control over Crimea and southeastern Ukraine. They wanted to change the borders. I found the conflict fascinating because I'm a child of the 80s. I grew up with Rambo, Rocky, Reagan fighting the Soviet Union. That's all I heard, 1980s. I love border talk as well. I mean, I have a binary brain that likes to classify things. This goes over here, that goes over there. And also, I was working on a very similar situation in writing a biography of this guy, Commandant General Nemesio Salcedo. Salcedo, from 1802 to 1813, was Commandant General of the internal provinces, meaning he was a preeminent military and civil authority over a region made up of what is today northern Mexico, Texas, and the American Southwest, but what was then considered the northern half of the Spanish colony of New Spain. The Commandant General's office was created primarily to deal with the various Indian threats to Spanish settlers, but what would be of most concern to Salcedo was the United States purchase of Louisiana in 1803. This would lead to disputes over the border that bore similarities to what was happening in Ukraine. In working on this biography, I had come across this 1811 map by Jose Antonio Pichardo, surveyor commissioned by the Spanish government to find a border that would be acceptable to both the United States and Spain. This map includes not only Pichardo's definition of the border, but three others who came before him. Therefore, keeping up with the conference's frontier theme and recognizing the GLO's love of maps, I told Brian that I would look at the various proposals, the logic behind them, and why none of them ended up serving as the final border between Spain and the United States. This was a huge mistake, as this turned out to be infinitely more complicated than I had planned. But I guess that's the thing with borders, though. They're very complicated. All right, so let's go back to the beginning of this whole Louisiana thing. When the United States purchased Louisiana from France in 1803, it wasn't exactly clear what Louisiana consisted of. In 1682, French explorer Robert La Salle traveled from French Canada all the way down the Mississippi to the Gulf and claimed the river, all rivers flowing into it, and all land touching those rivers in the name of France, calling the region Louisiana in honor of one of the various King Louis. Everything's Louis this, Louis that. This one happened to be Louis XIV. 3 years later, La Salle established a short-lived colony in Texas. Over the ensuing decades, so it would be basically this area. This would be western half of Louisiana, eastern half of Louisiana. Over the ensuing decades, the French founded settlements along the Gulf Coast, the Mississippi River, and the Red River post of Natchitoches, while French fur traders traveled deep into the North American interior to trade with a variety of American Indian groups. France's Spanish rivals worried that the French might encroach on their wealthy silver mines in New Spain's interior, and so in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they responded by expanding their colonial territory of New Spain into and beyond what is today Texas. They founded San Antonio, what is today Goliad, and in order to maximize their territorial claims, they established a mission and a presidio at Los Ades, just west of the French town of Natchitoches. Owing to supply issues, hostile Indians, and a relative peace between the two European nations, neither the French nor the Spanish founded permanent settlements on the opposite sides of the longitudinal border formed by Los Ades and Natchitoches. In 1762, the French ceded Louisiana west of the Mississippi to Spain near the end of the 7 Years' War. In Louisiana, except for New Orleans, to the east to the British, so basically split it at the Mississippi River. After losing Canada to the British, France saw little reason to stay in North America for a colony with little strategic or economic importance. With Spain now controlling both Louisiana and Texas, there was no impetus to define where one region ended and the other began. Spanish also saw little reason to maintain Los Ades, which was a drain on the treasury, and so the governor of Texas ordered it abandoned. Its inhabitants moved west and would later found the town of Nacogdoches in 1779, leaving the area between the new settlement and Natchitoches uninhabited by Europeans. Although there was no longer a national border, the region in between Nacogdoches and Natchitoches remained a linguistic and ethnic border. For the most part, Spanish-speaking people remained to the west, French speakers to the east. The area in between and to the north remained the realm of unincorporated Indians, like the Caddos, who traded with everyone. Some Indians raided selectively. Owing to this divide, there was expected to be little controversy when the Spanish king decided to sell Louisiana back to France in 1800 based on the conditions of the 1762 border. The border was meant to be with the same extent that it now has in the hands of Spain and that it had when France possessed it. The prospect of an uncomplicated turnover changed when France turned around and sold Louisiana to the expansionist United States in 1803. Initially, the Spanish hoped to annul the treaty, but in case they couldn't, which is kind of messed up because Spain sold Louisiana to France with the idea that France could not sell this to anyone else. If they did, they'd basically have to turn it back to Spain. But then France said, no, I'm going to go ahead and sell it to the United States. What are you going to do about it? So it was kind of in a tough place for Spain. So initially, the Spanish hoped, let's annul this thing. But in case they couldn't, they took measures to define the border in terms that were hopefully favorable to Spain, or at least fair according to history. Areas that had no border or were under Indian control now had to receive an official designation. All right, that's where we're going to get into this map. Spanish officials believed the best way to do this would be to show how Spain had defined the Louisiana border when France turned over the territory to Spain in 1762. Therefore, the king asked Spanish officials in Louisiana and New Spain to search the archives for contemporary maps and definitions. They wanted the Spanish definitions of the border. At this point, when they initially started looking into this, they didn't trust the French definitions of the border. They're going to change their mind a little bit later. And so this is where the first of the border lines comes from, okay? So we're going to look at, it's hard to see it from here. This is actually, so the GLO put this map together. We're going to be looking at this one right here by Angel de Martos, Navarrete, okay? This is this one. They've sort of defined his exaggerated border. We're going to be talking about this one, and it's really hard to see here, but this one he initially put right there. You see, it follows right there, okay? So we're going to follow this one, all right? So they uncovered information from the former Texas governor, Angel de Martos y Navarrete, which he assembled right around 1759. Basically, the governor of Texas, they asked him, what's Louisiana, what's Texas? This is what he came up with. So this particular line he came up with while France was still under Louisiana. They just dig the information up again after 1803 in hopes that they can show the United States, hey, look, this is how we defined it before the turnover. All right, so Martos's information and accompanying maps essentially argued that Texas extended from the coast up the Sabine River east to the Mississippi at the point that the Red River flowed into the Mississippi. See, I got a close-up version here. Right around here, it's this weird, wild sort of border that comes up here, and then it just attaches right here, and then it goes right over there. So I'll repeat exactly what he said. Extended from the coast up to the Sabine, east to the Mississippi, at the point that the Red River flowed into the Mississippi. It then followed the Red to the Arkansas, and then north until it hit the Missouri, which it then followed west, okay? All right, so he's basing the closest map I could find, because Martos himself, as far as I could tell, didn't draw a map himself, but there are maps from the time that make this same claim. This one is from the Marquis de Ruby expedition, a guy named Nicholas de la Fora. He put it here, and he's got a rough border that's pretty much the same of what Martos is arguing, okay? All right, so Martos recognized that this place was definitively French Natchitoches in Spanish territory, but he believed that this border, let me go back to this one right here, would properly separate the Indians who the Spanish had influence over from those with whom the French had more influence. In other words, he based this on Spain's missionary efforts. So the Indians and residents of this area were more culturally Spanish than French. Again, that would be, you see this border argument as well, they should be within our borders because they're more like us than you. All right, so this interpretation was questionable when France initially turned the area over to Spain, and it had no chance for approval in 1803. So he makes this claim, again, these Indians here are more like us than they are the French. And even in 1762, that wasn't really accurate, okay? Spanish missionary efforts east of the Sabine had been largely unsuccessful, and even during Martos' tenure, the Marquis de Ruby reported that, and this is a quote, there was not one single Indian in the mission of Los Chades, so they just didn't come to the missions. Indeed, even though the French never established their own missions in Louisiana, most of the Indians in this area were more closely connected with the French through trade than they had ever been with the Spanish, okay? So even in 1762, this border was questionable. The other problem is that before the Spanish would never have the opportunity to even put this border forward, because immediately after announcing the 1803 treaty, United States President Thomas Jefferson quickly dispatched soldiers to occupy New Orleans and other areas that were widely considered as recognized as being culturally French. Spain hoped to enforce this border, then they would have to remove American forces, an impossibility considering the military situation for Spain. So basically the United States occupies down here, you have US military presence here. They didn't push into Natchitoches immediately or anything like that, but any hope to getting this area, you were gonna have to remove the Spanish military, which Spain simply couldn't do at the time, okay? Military force is much too weak to do that. The other problem with Martos' definition was that exaggerated Spanish claims opened the door for the United States to make its own exaggerated claims about the border of Louisiana. When writing the Spanish governor of Louisiana in 1803, Jefferson initially said nothing about West Florida and Texas being a part of Louisiana. But he's going to add that these territories as part of the Louisiana Purchase when the French official who took temporary charge of Louisiana, Pierre Clement de la Salle, claimed that Louisiana extended to the Rio Grande. So by making this sort of exaggerated claim, well, if you make your exaggerated claim, then I'm going to make my exaggerated claim down here to the Rio Grande. Didn't happen exactly like that, but basically if we're doing that, Jefferson feels it's okay to go all the way down to the Rio Grande, all right? What this is going to do is send the Spanish scrambling to find a more believable border and one that they could reasonably assert. So the next suggestion on the map essentially comes from Commandant General Nemesio Salcedo. As we're going to see, he's going to get somebody to draw the border for him. So this is this yellow one that you're going to be following down here. Let me go to the clean version to see it much better. This is going to be the one that Salcedo's roughly going to propose, okay? So we're going to see it modified in a second here. When Salcedo learned of the turnover, he was already working on defining the border of Louisiana per a July order 1803 request from his brother Manuel Salcedo, who was the last governor of Louisiana, to assist in the turnover to France. So he was already prepping a border when he learned that the United States had purchased Louisiana and they would be turning it over to the US instead of France. When writing to Manuel on September 26, Salcedo insisted that the eastern border of the internal provinces was the coast lying between the, this is a quote, the quote, coast lying between the mouth of the sea or the Caracat or Carcassan River, which is the Calacoosa River, and the Armenta or Marmentayo in a straight line through the vicinity of the port of Natchitoches to the Colorado River. So right around here. So he actually is going to think that Natchitoches, claim that Natchitoches is part of New Spain, not actually part of Louisiana. So where it began, once it gets through Natchitoches, it's going to begin following the western bank of the Mississippi. So he's claiming that initially, everything west of the Mississippi would be Spanish territory. It seems he bases claim on information from the archives as a single piece of information from the archives that Spain and France had agreed to for the Calacoosa River. To the north, Salcedo is going to claim, and this is going to be right here, the quote, the boundary of this command extend beyond the Missouri River. So basically what this means, the second that the Missouri starts, that is where Spanish territory begins. It was his belief that, quote, this is as far as the Indian tribes who inhabit those countries have been subdued. So he believes that basically, where's it? Let's get to this clean map. Basically, the Spanish control everything up here because all Indians in this area have been subdued by the Spanish. Now, I think that he said this for two reasons. I don't think he understood how far the Missouri was north. I really don't think that. And I think at this point, he'd been in office less than a year. And I think he had this incredibly optimistic view about Spain's relationship with the Indians. You would have Comanches come in, they would host them, they would have this great relationship. He would talk with other Indian groups. He'd send messengers out to the Pawnees, things like that. And he was getting these promises from them. And he didn't understand that you have this unusual relationship. Sometimes the promises aren't upheld. They're not your subjects. I think his inexperience thought, these guys are nice to me, so they're going to listen to me, which that's my impression. And as we're going to see, that's not going to be the case. It's one of the poor things with poor Salcedo is he basically starts out such an enthusiastic guy, then the office beats him down, and by the end, he's just whatever, whatever the heck, Anyway, so he thought it was all the Indian tribes have been subdued up to Missouri. He did caution his brother that this geographic information might be lacking, as a few maps of the internal provinces in his possession were woefully incomplete. That's an understatement. Before he could bring his claims to the attention of the king, Salcedo needed someone to map them and to reinforce them. Therefore, in February 1804, he sought out Jose Maria de Jesus Puelles and asked him to assemble archival evidence and pre-existing maps to validate his own claims to the Texas border. Puelles had received cartography training, and in November of that year, he had drawn a map. Year prior, he had drawn a map of Texas for Salcedo. Some historians have interpreted Puelles' original map as influencing Salcedo to draw his border, but Salcedo had received the maps after he had already come up with his own definition of the border, so it was likely the other way around. So basically, Salcedo says, draw the border where you think it's going to be, but make sure it's pretty close to what I think it is, okay? And as a matter of fact, a later commissioner, Pichardo, said that Puelles devoted excessive attention to pleasing Salcedo. And you can see that in his version of the border. This is the one drawn by Puelles, which is pretty much what Salcedo wanted. He backed up Salcedo's claim for the most part. He did back off the claim to the west bank of the Mississippi River. He's going to put the border a little bit west of the Mississippi. I think this is after officials in Louisiana, a guy named Marquis de Casa Calvo, told him that you're not going to get that. We've had French fur traders up and down the West Coast for such a long time that's unreasonable. One thing I do find interesting is that in order to back up this claim, he's going to give credit to old stories that early French settlers had buried a cache of firearms near the Ouachita River to signify that, quote, the region north and west of here belonged to Spain. So he's saying, no, this border's correct because these French settlers buried some firearms here a long time ago. I think he just made that up. And as a matter of fact, a later Spanish border dryer, person who drew the border, commissioner, was called that claim an absurdity. Interesting, Poyas did not include Natchitoches on his version of the border, while Salcedo wanted him to, probably because Spain had never had a historical claim to it. So Salcedo, this is what I want. Now even that's a little too unreasonable. Spanish officer on the ground also felt that Salcedo's claim to Natchitoches was absurd. As Poyas was preparing his map, the commandant of the district of Nacogdoches, Jose Joaquin Ugarte, who is the son of a former commandant general, learned that American soldiers had recently arrived in Natchitoches to take charge of the town. Ugarte never considered that Spain had had a claim to the town. That's ridiculous. Everybody understood that area was controlled by the French. So Ugarte, in an effort to foster good relations with his new neighbors, the United States, traveled to Natchitoches, and on April 24, 1804, met with the commanding officer of the American forces, a guy named Edward Turner, and after the two men shared a pleasant conversation and assured one another that they would work together to maintain the peace, Ugarte presided over a formal ceremony turning over the town to the United States. He then returned to Nacogdoches and reported what he had done to Salcedo, expecting that the Commandant General would approve. So this is actually a picture of his turnover in St. Louis, but close enough. Instead, Salcedo read Ugarte's report and grew furious. Basically, you're giving this up. I wanted to claim this. As the Commandant General saw things, a Spanish official conducting a formal turnover was tantamount to not only recognizing the treaty, so Spain was still trying to say this treaty's invalid, but it also invalidated Spain's claim to Natchitoches, so he had Ugarte arrested. So this guy was the son of a Commandant General. He was an officer. He was making his way up in the Spanish military. Eventually probably would have, possibly could have been a Commandant General himself, and he ended up getting arrested. A couple years later, Zebulon Pike's going to run into him. He's going to be stationed out in the middle of nowhere. His career is sort of ruined by doing something that pretty much any reasonable person would expect. Salcedo's claim is invalidated by that. He's also going to be invalidated by the fact that not long after, Meriwether and Lewis are going to effectively disprove Salcedo's claim that the Spanish had subdued Indians along the Missouri River after they traveled the river and spoke with the various tribes. Some showed no evidence of contact with the Spanish. Those who did, like the Shoshone, said they sometimes traveled to New Mexico trade, but they were certainly not subdued, and as Lewis noted, these people are by no means friendly to the Spaniards. So basically, Martos' border, that's not going to work. Salcedo's border, already not going to work. And it's especially not going to work after 1806. What happens in 1806 is this, you're going to have this border crisis where Salcedo is going to have his men establish a camp just west of Natchitoches to lay claim to the territory. This action is almost going to lead to war, but Salcedo's subordinates are going to make an agreement with American General James Wilkinson to establish a neutral zone between the Sabine and the Arroyo Hondo, where neither party would settle until higher authorities could weigh in on the matter. So basically, you've got Salcedo's subordinates forming this demilitarized zone, again, discounting Salcedo's version of the border. All right, following year, 1807, the Spanish king is going to officially commission a map maker to draw his own version of the border. And this guy, his name's Father Melchor Telemantes, began working on his version of the map. And that is going to be this third line. There we go, right here, the blue one, all right? Telemantes was a well-educated Peruvian-born priest who took the viewpoint that, quote, the settlement of the French in Louisiana was due in large measure to the generous condescension and the tolerance of Spain and to her relations with the French House of Bourbon. In other words, he's basically saying we should have all of Louisiana because we could have kicked the French's butt out of there anytime we want, so it's actually all ours, just trust me, bro. We could have taken it. So anyway, for this reason, he's going to argue it that Louisiana should extend only as far as there had actually been permanent French settlements. Everything else should belong to Spain because they could have taken it prior to 1763 if they wanted. Telemantes said the United States should not control the Missouri River because although French fur traders have been traveling and trading on it for a century, it was not part of settled Louisiana. The Nootka Sound Treaty with the British furthered this claim. Nootka Sound Agreement basically said the British and Spanish would not let any other nations, there's a series of agreements in the 1790s where they both agreed that neither nation would allow anyone else to settle in the Pacific Northwest. So we're not going to settle up there. We're going to maintain, we're going to have fur traders. We could send expeditions up there, but we're not going to let anybody else up there. So he's going to keep up with that claim, right? So Telemantes recognized that even though by definition Spain controlled the Missouri, even though they had never settled there again, the reality was that Spain could not supply a settlement there, and they would have no way to stop the Americans from using the river, and with American control of the Missouri, they could trade with its Indians, so that would get rid of Spain's claim to having subdued the Indians. Telemantes therefore favored a border that started at the source of the Arkansas River and followed it roughly to the meridian where the Natchitoches River and the Colorado came together. It then arced down with the eastern border falling east of Los Cedés. This area was defendable by Spain. Indians there had traded with Spain in the past, and it met his settlement definition. So come here, let's see, source of the Arkansas River, so here, and then followed it roughly the meridian where the Natchitoches and the Colorado came together, then arced down with the eastern border falling east of Los Cedés. And again, his argument is we should have all of it. Okay, we should have all of it, but this is what we're going to go ahead and we can defend this. And Indians here had traded with the Spanish in the past. So this was fairly reasonable plan. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention. He's going to claim, and this is actually in spite of the Nootka Sound Agreement, that Spanish territory includes the western half of the continent right here. So the second that the Arkansas has its source, you draw a line north all the way up to the North Pole, and that's going to be Spanish territory, everything to the west, all right? So except for that, this was a reasonable plan, and Spain had actually proven they could defend this area. In 1806, the Spanish had intercepted the Freeman and Custis expedition when it was making its way along the Red River. And in 1807, Indians allied with Spain told officials of an American expedition under Zebulon Pike, allowing the Spanish to arrest Pike. So they could actually stop people in this region. So the area was defendable, and the Indians of the region, at least in 1807, had political ties to Spain, okay? Telemantes' interpretation did put a small American settlement, recently settled Bayou Pierre, in a handful of American ranches in Spanish territory, but it's imaginable that a situation or a solution could be dealt with concerning those areas. Therefore, the only unreasonable part of Telemantes' border was his belief that Spanish territory extended north from the source of the Arkansas to the North Pole. Claiming sovereignty over this area went against Spain's promise, again, part of the Nootka Sound Agreement, not to, quote, claim any right of sovereignty or territorial dominion over the Pacific Northwest. Spain tried to enforce this border, it might lead to war with Britain. The other issue was that Commandant General Salcedo felt it surrendered too much territory to the United States, although at this point the Commandant General had stepped back and allowed the Spanish crown to handle things. Whether or not this would have become an issue is not known because Telemantes would never have the opportunity to present his version of the border to the king. After Napoleon took over Spain in 1808, Telemantes supported the Viceroy of New Spain, who felt that his colonies should break away from the mother country instead of offering allegiance to a government in exile. This upset conservatives in New Spain, who felt they had to maintain some sort of connection to some authority in Spain, and they felt that breaking away bordered on treason, even if they're going to argue we're just breaking away from Napoleon's government. The conservatives in Mexico had Telemantes arrested, and he's going to die in prison of cholera. It's at this point we're going to get our final border interpretation, and this is going to be the one that is going to be put forth by Jose Antonio Pichardo. That's the guy who actually drew this map, the one that we're using for the whole thing. So he's going to take over as soon as Telemantes is arrested, and he's going to spend the next 4 years coming up with his own interpretations of the limits of Louisiana. Pichardo is actually going to write this huge treatise, which is, you can get it, it's translated to English, it's 4 volumes. It's going to be extensive, and it's going to basically encapsulate every reason that he believes Spain should have title to this area, okay? Basically, he's going to go back to, we should have claim to this area because conquistadors like De Soto, Coronado, they were there first. He writes an entire book about exactly where Coronado and De Soto went to establish his claims. He's also going to include specific information from this Dominguez Escalante journey, which took place in 1776. That's why this is so detailed because there was a Spanish expedition out here, and to sort of show his claim to the area, look how much we know about it. So Pichardo, he's going to basically say, again, we should have this huge area, but he recognized that you just can't claim everything. This is what I think we should have, but you can't have everything. So he's going to rely primarily on maps drawn in the late 1700s by the French, particularly this French map maker named Jean-Baptiste d'Anville, who placed the border between the Sabine and the Mississippi River, and then the Sabine and the Red River, okay? So the Spanish initially didn't want to trust the French maps because, you know, they would have drawn the border with an exaggerated version of Louisiana, but now that days are ticking by, the United States looks like it's pressuring over here, that French line doesn't look too bad anymore. So that's basically what Pichardo's going to go with. So this is going to maintain the border between Natchitoches and Nacogdoches, and it's going to lower the northeastern border to the Red River instead of the Arkansas. He basically, Pichardo felt that because the border had been accepted by the French, it should be accepted by the Americans. Again, the whole treaty goes back to what the French thought Louisiana was. The French and Spanish thought it was in 1762. It would also avoid the difficulties created by including the American settlement of Bayou Pierre in Spanish territory. The Commandant General likely approved of Pichardo's contention that Spain controlled all of North America west of the 100th degree latitude. So he's given up a huge chunk of land here, but basically you're going to maintain this claim that everything west of the 100th is Spanish territory. The British, again, would be upset about that if this went through, but it would retain a lot of Spanish territory. Again, he retains Telemantes Claim to North Pole, just moves it slightly east. Pichardo felt this border was defendable. Spain just needs to build presidios in the Arkansas and the Missouri to stop American commerce coming down it. So I don't know how he proposed to supply these things, but you just put some forts up here and everything will be fine. Unlike Salcedo's unrealistic expectations, a lot of historians have come to regard this as sane and correct, something the United States might realistically accept as a definitive border. Unfortunately for Pichardo, it took him 4 years to reach his conclusion, and he would die before he could issue an official proposal to the Spanish king. So he comes up with this border, but before he can sell the border, he's going to die. It's not like the Spanish crown would have been in a lot of position to focus attention on it anyway. Not only did they have to deal with Napoleon, but they're going to have, they're dealing with Napoleon primarily. They have a revolution shortly after that as well. This is going to leave the issue of a border matter of dispute until 1819. And as we all know, it was that year that Secretary of State John Adams and Louis Niepce met to discuss the United States acquisition of Florida. Using a variety of evidence, including Pichardo's map, Onís and Adams settled on our modern, well, at least the 1890 understanding of the border. Basically, the mouth of the Sabine to the Red River, to the 100th latitude, north to the Arkansas, then to its source, then west into the Pacific. So all this is to say, incredibly complicated borders, but that's the whole thing with borders, they're incredibly complicated. All right. What's up? Oh, sorry.
If there are any questions, please put your hand up. All right.
Having been tested, I'm now going to give a test. That northern part of the final border, the Adams-Onís border, is the 42nd parallel, right?
Yep.
What part of Canada is below the 42nd parallel?
Well, it's not Vancouver Island. I mean, that's north of there. I have no idea.
Put the map back up.
Okay.
It's a peninsula that extends into Lake Erie.
Oh, the 49th.
No,
Sure?
not the 49th.
Oh.
The 42nd. It curves.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, hey, geography. I learned something. That's awesome. I did not know that.
My students have a lot of trouble with that question.
And I made these maps myself, so I don't think I got the curves very, very correct. So that might be off a little bit.
Well, the lines curve.
Okay.
and they curve just enough that it cuts off a piece of Ontario
Okay.
that's below the 42nd parallel. The 42nd parallel is...
Oh, are you saying over here?
Sure, like...
Okay, all
Lake
right.
Erie.
I was confused for a second.
No.
Okay, that makes sense.
Lake
Yeah.
Erie. The 42nd parallel is the border between Oregon and California.
Yeah.
That's the
Yep.
Adams-O'Neese Treaty.
Yeah.
And if you follow that line east, it cuts off a piece of Canada.
That makes sense. Okay, I was really confused. Like I was wondering my geography lessons, but yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Sure.
I thought I might get you on that one.
You did. Excellent. That's really great, actually.
Are there any other questions?
I'll ask you a question. We have this chunk of the United States up here. What's the story with that? Lake of the Woods. I got it. I was going to ask that. All right, you knew it.
That's how they did it. The other question that fools my students is what part of French Canada is still French? They vote in French elections.
It's not Quebec.
Oh, he got it over here.
Where is it?
The islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon off the coast of Newfoundland.
Awesome. Great.
They're fishing islands.
Guyana, French Guyana still votes in French elections, correct?
You got a question?
Yes.
Yeah. Great.
Right here.
Pichardo's Treatise appears to be one of those documents we'd all like to see digitized, but doesn't appear to have been. Do you know of any, or has there been any effort to do that?
So I believe that was published in 41, so it should be coming up for, oh, I'm sorry, like the original. I don't know where the original is. I use the English version, so that one was published in I believe 41, something like that, so that should be coming up for copyright laws very soon. I don't know where the original is. I can almost promise you it would be on Pares, P-A-R-E-S, the Spanish archive website. I don't know for sure, but I'm willing to bet it would be up there. It's a great question. Geography quiz. I love that stuff. Seriously, if anybody can come up with more, or any other question, of course.
I've got two quick comments. One, the Pichardo map was offered to the GLO a couple years ago for purchase for 7 figures, and we had to turn it down, unfortunately. And two, for the rest of the story on how the Republic of Texas and Louisiana completed the border, we have a story map that was created by Julia Bordelon right over here, who's one of our new employees. And we'll send that link out in the next couple of days. So, not a question, but a comment.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.